Today, the heroin epidemic is considered a national crisis.
Now yet another city has seen a massive surge in overdoses.
It's been 40 years and billions of dollars since the last heroin epidemic.
So far this year, almost 200 people died of overdoses of heroin.
Crimes of violence in America will double by 1972. We cannot accept that kind of future for America.
In the late 1960s, America's inner cities were hit by a wave of violent crime and heroin addicts seeking money for drugs. Politicians responded with harsh penalties. The war on drugs was born.
There should be no confusion or question as to what the driving force behind those laws was. Punishment, deterrence, not rehabilitation.
40 years and hundreds of billions of dollars later, the nation's prisons are packed with drug offenders.
Heroin is now causing more deaths than car crashes or violent crimes.
And heroin is back. But the users...
I don't look like a heroin addict.
And the response...
It's a health issue. We have people dying.
...are profoundly changed.
Previously, it was people in the inner city. It was those people.
But now, the lawmakers have a connection. Addiction is in their backyard. It's in their house. It's in their basement.
New York City has the worst narcotics problem in the country.
And watch this, here comes the sale. Here goes the stuff, boom.
In the late 1960s and early 1970s, New York City struggled with high rates of heroin addiction and the crime that went with it.
I would stick up. I would steal.
Those were tough times. There was a great deal of fear abroad in the community.
Under intense pressure, including from leading African-American politicians, New York State tried a variety of approaches, even forced treatment, to solving the heroin problem.
Let's tell it like it is. We have achieved very little permanent rehabilitation.
Frustrated, in 1973, Nelson Rockefeller proposed the harshest drug laws in the nation.
The motivation for the governor was to be punitive. They said, let's tell it like it is. Now we have to have very tough penalties. Emphasis on penalties, which will deter drug use.
Former state senator John Dunn was one of the sponsors of the new laws.
The most serious provision in the law was mandatory incarceration for a term of imprisonment up to life for the sale of any amount greater than 1 ounce of heroin.
But New York was not the only city fighting a heroin epidemic.
In the slums of Washington, D.C.,
Washington, D.C. took a more medical approach.
We took urine samples from everybody who came into the jail. 44% of them were positive for heroin.
Dr. Robert DuPont started a treatment program at the Department of Corrections. It offered the city's addicts an experimental heroin replacement drug, methadone.
Methadone, a bitter, inexpensive synthetic drug that the city hopes most addicts will choose over a $50 a day heroin habit and all of the crime that goes with that.
Most of our patients were people from the criminal justice system. We ended up treating 15,000 heroin addicts. Overdose deaths went from 70 a year to 4. The crime rate on a monthly basis was cut in half over that period of time.
The city's experience caught the attention of President Richard Nixon.
America's public enemy #1 in the United States is drug abuse.
In 1971, Nixon declared war on drugs, and methadone treatment was part of his plan.
Looking back at some of Nixon policies, they were moving towards a public health approach, but that came to a screeching halt.
There were fresh needle marks in her left arm, and the coroner said she died of an overdose of drugs.
Heroin was all over the media. The public's fear grew. Tough New York-style drug laws and heavy mandatory sentences spread across the country. And Washington, D.C.'s success lowering crime with methadone was overshadowed.
The politics said, let's get tough. The tougher you are, the more politically viable you're going to be. And that was more police, more prisons, longer sentences.
We are waging a war on drugs, and we are losing.
Police, open up, we got a warrant here.
In 1988, frustrated by his city's raging drug problem, Baltimore Mayor Kurt Schmoke, a former federal prosecutor, began to openly challenge the lock-'em-up approach.
It's not solving the problem, it's not getting to the answer, and we're wasting millions of resources and millions of lives.
He even suggested decriminalization.
You weren't going to be able to prosecute your way out of addiction. If we went after it as a health problem, I think in the long run we'd get both a reduction in crime and a reduction in addiction rates.
His idea sparked a lot of debate, but went nowhere.
It's immoral, it's illegal, and it's not going to happen.
As the AIDS crisis hit, the stakes around heroin grew even higher.
By far the most common way heterosexuals get AIDS is through intravenous drug use.
There is an alarming new concentration of AIDS cases among inner-city blacks and Hispanics.
Hoping to save lives, Schmoke started an experimental clean needle exchange.
You only could get AIDS through sexual intercourse or sharing needles.
Baltimore's HIV rate plummeted. Schmoke then tried, without success, to convince the federal government to fund needle exchanges nationwide.
There were many people that just thought it was retreat in the war on drugs. We were, quote, sending the wrong signal.
A free needle exchange program is a free needle exchange for a felon.
The heroin problem was still perceived as an inner city problem, and to some people, just a problem of people of color. So you had all these representatives from districts that viewed the problem as those people, not our people.
Despite that perception, by then, the vast majority of new heroin users were white. The nation continued trying to punish away the drug problem, which also now included crack cocaine. But ironically, it turned out that back when New York passed its Rockefeller drug laws, the city's heroin crisis was already subsiding on its own.
Drug epidemics often burn themselves out rather quickly.
Although older addicts remained, there was a dramatic drop in new users. In Harlem, researchers found teenagers shunned heroin after observing its devastating impact.
Younger siblings and cousins or peers, people who witness it from very close hand, take note. By the time you are of age to really think about that experimentation, you've already seen negative consequences.
But this trend made little difference to the public and had little impact on the escalating war on drugs and crime.
As the heroin epidemic was petering out, we brought in these laws. There's something very sad about that, in that we set in motion this whole system for over a generation that perhaps was not necessary.
For John Dunn, the harsh drug laws he helped pass were turning out to be a mistake.
My conversion originated really based in civil rights issues.
In 1990, Dunn went to Washington to serve in the Department of Justice.
I was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, which led me to visit a number of federal prisons. I was shocked to find the number of inmates who were there really as a result of criminal laws such as we had enacted in the 70s.
Dunn saw that inner-city drug users and small-time dealers, mostly young African-American men, filled the nation's jails.
It was relatively easy to pick drug sellers off the street where the trade was going on. Those who were engaged in nonviolent, drug-related crimes really constituted the vast proportion of those who were being sent to prison. The rate and relative percentages of incarceration among minority communities has had a devastating effect.
After he left the Justice Department, Dunn returned to New York to try to reverse the harsh drug laws he had helped pass.
The number of heroin users has nearly doubled in just the past 3 years.
It's been 40 years and billions of dollars since the last heroin epidemic. and the United States is again facing a heroin crisis.
Mary is 24 years old, 5 months pregnant, and hooked on heroin.
In the 1970s, it was an inner city problem, and it was a young man of color. It's not that now. It's equally men and women, and it's primarily white.
Authorities say the heroin surge is directly linked to the widespread abuse of prescription painkillers in this country.
4 in 5 heroin users started out by misusing prescription drugs.
When I was around 14 years old, my mom was actually on pain medicine, and I had real easy access to it.
Joe Farmer is typical of what the media calls the new face of heroin. He's young, white, middle class, and lives in rural Hagerstown, Maryland.
I started using heroin when I was 17. Someone told me, you know, I can't get pills, but, you know, I can get raw or heroin.
He was sent to Maryland's Washington County Detention Center on heroin-related theft charges.
Have a seat.
The jail was one of the first in the nation to offer medication-assisted treatment with a drug called Vivitrol.
And we will get your Vivitrol shots here every month until you're released.
Okay. You're not allergic to Band-Aids, tape, or anything like that? Okay.
Unlike methadone, an opiate which replaces heroin, long-acting Vivitrol blocks heroin's effects.
Vivitrol works on your opiate receptors, and it blocks them.
Ready for a little sting?
It's just a shot you get every month, and it just keeps you from getting high.
Rebecca Hogemeyer started the program in 2011. She believes Vivitrol will help newly detoxed addicts stay clean after they leave jail.
I was thinking they could offer this medication and you could reduce recidivism at the same time.
Right.
We've been arresting them for how long, and it hasn't helped. Has it made heroin addiction go away? Has it decreased the demand for heroin? No, it hasn't.
How does naloxone work? What happens is the heroin's in their body.
Washington County also started training police to use Narcan, a drug that stops overdoses in progress.
In the last 2 years, over 30 states have implemented laws for Narcan. The whole United States has changed their perspective and are looking at addiction as a public health issue.
We must address it as a public health care crisis.
My husband Frank and I buried a child to drug addiction. So we must invest more in the treatment of drugs.
Mike Pence is changing his stance on allowing needle exchanges to operate statewide.
Now the lawmakers have a connection. That is where the compassion is.
Joe Farmer is grateful to be in jail at a time when the focus is on rehabilitation, not just punishment.
I know I'm at the point where I need to do this for myself and actually make something out of myself.
As for John Dunn's effort to help rescind the Rockefeller drug laws, it took over a decade. And there is now broad consensus that mass incarceration can't solve the nation's drug problems.
Part of what brought about a change is an awareness that punitive measures are not the answer, but also that it's happening to me, it's happening to us, it's happening to my family.
The lives that could have been saved, the families that would have remained intact, the war on drugs was pretty devastating to the United States, and hopefully we've seen the error of our ways and are going to move in a different direction.